Hello, little dreamer. In a village where rain always fell gently, something changed. One day, the drops rose to the sky, and a quiet weaver followed them into wonder. There once was a town where the rain had always fallen the proper way, softly, downward, in thin silver threads that stitched puddles into the earth. The village, nestled between low green hills and curling fog, was known simply as Lanterns Hollow. The people there wore slippers instead of boots, for the rain came gently and the paths were mossy and kind beneath their steps. No storm ever raised its voice. No thunder scolded the sky. Every morning, old Mr. Tallow lit the lanterns by the cobbled bridge, and every evening, the baker's daughter hummed lullabies to the loaves rising in her oven. The world moved in slow, predictable turns, like a clock too polite to tick loudly. But one late autumn morning, as the mist still clung to the eaves of every cottage, something peculiar occurred. A drop of water, clear and bright, floated upward from a puddle by the well. It shimmered like a pearl caught in moonlight, rising with no breeze to carry it. Another drop followed, then 3, then 7. Soon, the puddles themselves began to shrink, not from soaking into the thirsty earth, but from drifting toward the clouds above. No one noticed at first. It was the kind of town where changes happened so slowly, they were often mistaken for dreams. But by the third day, when umbrellas began to gather dust and wells no longer brimmed, the townsfolk gathered in curious hushes at windows and porches, blinking up at the sky not with fear, but wonder. And far away, near the edge of town, a quiet weaver named Elira paused at her loom. She had been spinning cloud thread, soft gray wool laced with silver, and as the rain rose, her fingers stopped mid-motion. She felt something stir inside her chest. A question. A yearning. And so the rain, quite unlike itself, began not with a fall, but with a rising. Elira had always felt a little out of place in Lanterns Hollow, though she was as gentle as the fog and as quiet as the hills. She lived in a cottage with windows that faced the forest on one side and the sky on the other. Her loom sat near the largest window, where she could see the clouds roll lazily over the trees and disappear behind the hills like shy beasts. Each morning, she would weave. Not for money, nor for fame, but because she loved the rhythm. Her tapestries weren't for walls or markets, they were made of mist-dyed wool and sky-colored threads, embroidered with raindrops, stitched with whispers. She called them weather cloths, and no two were ever alike. But since the rain began to rise, the sky had changed. It looked emptier, somehow. Pale. As though something important had been misplaced. Elira noticed how still the birds had become, how leaves hung in mid-motion, how the air felt like it was listening. She took one of her cloths and held it to the breeze. It didn't flutter. Instead, it tugged gently toward the clouds, as if the fabric itself was curious, asking to be taken with the rain. That evening, as the stars blinked softly into place, Elira sat beside the old stone well and placed a tiny silver bell into its dry base. She whispered a wish, not with words, but with stillness. I will follow, she thought, watching a single drop rise like a reversed tear, glimmering in the lantern light. The rain was rising, and she would rise with it, not in body, but in dream, in spirit, in something quieter than a question and older than a storm. She wrapped her skycloth around her shoulders, picked up her satchel of cloud thread, and stepped into the unfolding hush. The journey had begun. The path Alira followed was one she had walked many times before, between willows that whispered softly even in still air, across bridges whose would remembered every footstep. Yet tonight, something subtle had changed. The world wore a hush that felt newly born. As if the sky had taken a long breath and the earth had chosen to listen. Above her, the rain no longer fell. It floated, delicate and slow, like blossoms on an unseen stream. Droplets drifted upward, shimmering in threads of pale light. Some held fragments of reflection, clouds, rooftops, the curve of a lantern's glow, but they no longer mirrored the ground. They shimmered with something deeper, as though they remembered dreams more clearly than windows remembered faces. Alira paused beneath a tall ash tree, its branches still and silver with dew that refused to fall. She reached into her satchel and drew out a folded tapestry, one of her oldest, made long ago in a season when sleep had come uneasily. It was embroidered with curved lines and spirals, stitched in fog gray and moon thread. She had never quite known why she had woven it, until now. Unfolding it beneath the rising rain, she saw that the tapestry matched the land around her. Not in landmarks or roads, but in feeling. The swirls aligned with the drift of the mist. The lines pointed where the droplets seemed to float most gently. It was not a map of places, but of moments, of hushes, of things that called and things that waited. She walked again, following the spiral path the threads had whispered. The mist deepened, cool and sweet on her cheeks. Crickets stilled their songs. The wind held its breath. And then, through the drifting veil of mist, she saw it. A pool. Round and glass smooth. Not a lake, not quite, too perfectly round. At its center, a stone rose like the back of a sleeping creature. Raindrops floated upward from its surface like sparks rising from an untouched candle. Alira stepped close, heart unhurried, thoughts softened like wool before the weave. This was where the rain began to forget how to fall. The pool did not ripple. Its surface was so still that even breath seemed to tiptoe around it. When Alira knelt beside it, her reflection did not meet her eyes, it looked upward, into the rising sky, where drops of water glittered like stars drifting homeward. Around the pool's edge, flowers bloomed in silence. Not wildflowers, but something stranger, petals shaped like tiny sails, stems that curved as if cradling wind. They did not bow to gravity. Some leaned upward, toward the sky, as if reaching for their own names. Alira touched one gently. It was cool beneath her fingers and soft as folded mist. When she let go, a single petal detached and floated upward, joining the slow ascent of the water. "This place," she whispered, though no one heard. "This is where the rain unlearns the ground." She sat, drawing her knees beneath her, and opened her satchel again. This time, she took out a small spindle of thread the color of smoke. She began to spin, the wheels soft beneath her touch, and as she worked, she listened, not for sound, but for pattern. For the slow rhythm of the rising rain, the distant sigh of leaves, the breath of something larger than herself. Each thread she spun carried a question she did not know how to ask. Where does forgotten rain go? What happens to water that never touches soil? Can something rise for so long it forgets where it began? As she wove, her cloth began to take shape, round, like the pool. Pale, like morning fog. She stitched a border of petals that drifted upward and circles that moved without end. The cloth did not weigh down in her lap, it fluttered, lightly, as though eager to follow the rain. Elira did not know how long she sat there. Time had lost its usual footsteps. But she knew one thing for certain. The world was not broken. It was remembering something. And she, somehow, had remembered it too. As the night crept onward and stars blinked gently above, a shape moved in the hush beyond the pool. It was not sharp or sudden, nothing in this world would be, but it glided through the mist like an idea just before waking. A bird, delicate and unfamiliar, stepped from the shadows of the ash trees. Its feathers shimmered like damp silk, the colors shifting gently from pale blue to cloud gray. Raindrops clung to its wings, not falling but floating, held in place like memories unwilling to leave. It did not speak, for birds do not need words when silence carries so much. But its eyes met Elira's, and in that quiet gaze was the weightless certainty of shared understanding. The bird dipped its beak into the pool, not to drink, but to trace a pattern across its surface. As it moved, ripples began to flow in reverse, circling outward and upward, each one carrying a glimmer of something not yet born. Elira felt the pull of the moment. She opened her new tapestry and held it toward the bird. The fabric, light as fog, trembled as though recognizing the creature. And then, with grace that belonged only to the world between worlds, the bird stepped onto the cloth. Not a wrinkle formed beneath its talons. Not a sound escaped. The bird simply rested, its wings folding gently, droplets still gleaming in quiet suspension. Together, weaver and bird sat at the edge of the pool, the rising rain humming in soft harmony around them. Elira closed her eyes. And for the first time since the rain changed direction, she dreamed. The dream did not arrive as stories often do. It had no clear beginning, no names, no firm outlines. Instead, it drifted in, slow as a fog bank rolling over the sea. Gentle. Luminous. Elira saw a loom taller than the sky, its beams carved from starlight, its threads made from time. A figure, not quite seen but deeply felt, wove with hands both ancient and kind. Every motion, every pull, shaped weather and memory, breath and wind. Each thread shimmered with moments, a single leaf falling in spring, a pebble skipped across a silver stream, the sigh of a grandmother beside a candle flame. The figure turned, and though its face was a haze of twilight, Elira felt no fear. Only recognition. She was not a stranger to the great loom. She had always been part of it. In the dream, the weaver offered her a thread that pulsed with rain and quiet questions. Elira took it, and the loom accepted her touch. Together, they shaped a pattern that had never been woven before, one of reversed raindrops, of rising waters and petals that did not fall. When she awoke, Dawn was beginning to blush at the edges of the sky. The bird had vanished without stirring the mist. But in her lap, the tapestry remained, completed without her hands. It was no longer just a cloth. It was a map, a memory, a message. And the path ahead was no longer hidden. It was rising, just like the rain. Alira followed the quiet guidance of her tapestry, the woven map that now pulsed gently when held in the light of the rising dawn. It did not point with arrows or names. Instead, it glowed more warmly when she stepped in the right direction, as though the threads themselves remembered the way. She walked until the trees gave way to a clearing she had never known existed, though it lay not far from the edges of Lantern's Hollow. There, nestled between two soft hills and half-veiled in mist, lay a village so still that it seemed to be holding its breath. There were no shadows in this place. The light, pale and pearlescent, filtered through a sky that held no sun yet shimmered with presence. Buildings, gently curved and moss-covered, leaned together like old friends whispering secrets. Smoke curled upward from chimneys, yet no voices rang out. No footsteps broke the quiet. Alira stepped forward. The mist clung gently to her ankles, cool and welcoming. A child sat beneath a window, silent, holding a glass jar filled with water. The water floated in the jar like a cloud trapped in a snow globe. When Alira passed, the child did not speak, but offered her the jar. Inside it, a single droplet rose, spun once, then stilled. Alira bowed slightly in thanks, took the jar, and carried it close. No one in the village moved with urgency. Some sat in doorways, knitting air. Others stood with eyes closed, listening to songs only they could hear. It was a place that existed beside time, not within it. A village that had learned stillness. And within that stillness, something was waiting. Alira found a bench beneath a tree with translucent leaves and rested. The tapestry stirred gently in her lap. The jar warmed slightly in her hand. Then a voice, older than the hills, spoke from behind her. "You've followed the rain," it said, "and now the rain has followed you." The voice belonged to a woman whose age could not be counted in years. Her face was lined with stories, not time, and her eyes held the color of distant rain clouds. She wore a robe of layered silks, each layer patterned with petals, winds, or sky. "I am Meryl," she said softly, "keeper of what grows without earth." She guided Alira through the silent village and into a courtyard enclosed by arches of bone-pale stone. Inside, a garden shimmered, not with green leaves or curling vines, but with glass. Delicate stems of crystal reached toward the sky. Blossoms of translucent color bloomed soundlessly, catching the light of the mist like prisms. Droplets floated through the garden, feeding the flowers without ever falling. Alira gasped quietly. "It's beautiful," she said, not aloud, but in the soft way of breath meant only for moments like this. Meryl nodded. "These grow only from questions," she explained. "Each flower is born of wonder that was never answered, and never needed to be. They feed on possibility." Alira walked slowly among them. One blossom opened as she passed, revealing a spiral within its petals, turning inward forever. Another shimmered in hues she had no name for, colors made of longing and laughter and something lost long ago. "I came because the rain rose," Alira said. "And something in me rose with it." "Of course," Meryl replied. "Rain forgets nothing. It travels the full shape of the world, above and below. When it changes direction, it means something has shifted in the weave of wonder." She placed her hand gently on Alira's shoulder. "You carry a thread that needs to be placed in the loom of the sky." Alira's heart beat softly. The jar in her satchel glowed faintly. The tapestry stirred. And far above, the clouds turned, just slightly, revealing the first glimpse of a staircase made of mist and memory, leading skyward. The next part of her journey was calling. The staircase did not begin with stone. It began with breath. It rose from the center of the glass garden, where the mist gathered most thickly. With each quiet inhalation, the shapes became clearer, steps woven not from marble or wood, but from the threads of forgotten thoughts and quiet hopes. They shimmered with the silver of early dawn and the softness of lullabies. Alira touched the first step with cautious reverence. It held her weight not as a surface might, but as a story holds its first word, delicately, yet completely. She began to climb. Around her, the world dropped away with gentleness, not like a fall, but like a curtain drawn back. The village below faded into quiet, and the garden disappeared into the clouds. The only sound was the sigh of rising rain and the soft rustle of her tapestry as it fluttered beside her like a second skin. As she rose, she began to see moments, not with her eyes, but with her sense of being. To her left floated a memory of a child placing a single feather into a stream. To her right, the shape of an old man lighting a lantern for no reason but warmth. Each memory hovered in the air like dew, then drifted past as gently as snow. The higher she climbed, the slower time became. Or perhaps time simply paused to listen. She felt no fear. Only presence. A sense of belonging to something vast and kind. And then, at the top of the staircase, she stepped onto a wide platform made of woven light. There was no sky, no ground, only a space of in-between. In the center stood a loom. Not the great loom of her dream. A smaller one. Humble. Waiting. Her own. And beside it, a bowl filled with rising raindrops. The loom was familiar, though she had never touched it before. Its frame curved like the boughs of a willow, and its thread stretched outward, not upward or downward, but in spirals and stars. It hummed with a music that was more feeling than sound. Alira stepped closer and placed the jar into the bowl of raindrops. The drop inside joined the others, spinning slowly. They did not mix. Each remained its own shape, its own question. But they danced together, as though sharing a secret. She opened her tapestry. The cloth had changed. It now shimmered with images she had not woven, moments she had lived but never noticed. The way she once paused to watch a snail cross a stone. The time she mended a neighbor's curtain just because it was torn. The dream she had as a child of sleeping in a cradle made of wind. These were the threads the loom accepted. She began to weave, not as she had in her cottage, but as one who listens while their hands remember. Each motion brought rain upward, each knot tied a breeze, each strand called back a forgotten sky. As she wove, the platform beneath her glowed more brightly. Shapes formed in the space below, villages waking, children laughing as raindrops floated into their palms, elders raising jars to catch the sky's new language. The rain no longer rose alone. It carried meaning. And it fell again, but not as before. This time, the rain fell both ways, rising to carry wonder, falling to water the quiet roots of the world. Elira finished her cloth and draped it over the loom. The mist bowed gently. And somewhere far below, a bell rang once, not for warning, but for welcome. The weaving was complete. When Elira descended the staircase of mist, the steps did not vanish, nor did the sky forget her name. Each footfall left behind a whisper of light, a thread of memory now woven into the rain's rhythm. The platform above faded into the pale heavens, but its presence lingered, like the afterglow of a lullaby. As she returned to the earth, she found the village of no shadows changed, yet unchanged. Flowers in the glass garden now swayed gently, as if touched by an unseen breeze. The villagers no longer sat in perfect stillness. They moved slowly, dreamily, with eyes that shimmered as though they had seen something long forgotten. Meryl stood beneath the archway of her quiet garden and bowed her head. "The sky remembers," she whispered. Elira nodded, and her hand brushed against the tapestry folded at her side. It no longer glowed, but its weight had changed. It carried peace now. And meaning. She walked back through Lantern's Hollow as dawn stretched gently across the hills. The old baker's daughter was outside, humming to her loaves again, though now her song was different, sweet and strange, like a tune borrowed from the wind. And from the eaves, drops of rain drifted upward once more, but only for a moment. Some returned to the clouds. Others paused in midair, then fell back down, soft and warm, as if they had decided where they wished to go. Elira returned to her cottage, the window wide, the loom waiting. She did not begin a new weave. Not yet. Instead, she placed the tapestry in the window, where the breeze might read it, where the rising rain might carry its story. Outside, the sky turned quietly over itself. And inside, Elira closed her eyes. Not to forget, but to remember. It is said that after the rain learned to rise, dreams flowed more freely through the world. Wells filled with reflections no one remembered seeing. Leaves curled into gentle spirals and children sang songs with no known beginning. The skies still wept sometimes, as skies do, but their tears were wiser now, and sometimes laughter fell alongside them. Elira's weathercloths became something else entirely. No longer only for comfort, they became guides for those who needed to find what they hadn't known they'd lost. Each was stitched not with answers, but with permission to wonder. She wove less often. Not from weariness, but from knowing when to rest. Some say she became part of the mist. Others claim she is still there, behind a window, weaving silence into something sacred. And if one listens gently enough, they say the rain will carry her thread into dreams, upward, downward, and always homeward. And the rain, oh yes, it still rises from time to time. Not as a mistake, but as a reminder that the world is full of unseen journeys, that not all things must fall to be whole, that even rain, with all its softness, carries the strength to change the sky. And in the hush of that thought, the world turns softly in its sleep. Deep in the forest, an owl named Oleron dreamed of the sea. Though he had never seen it, he followed the dream across wind and stars, until the waves called him home. In the ancient forests of Merdwen Wood, where the trees grew tall enough to touch the stars and moss blanketed the ground like a lullaby, lived an owl named Oleron. He was not the oldest owl, nor the wisest, but he dreamed differently than the others. While most owls dreamed of gliding through night winds and listening to secrets whispered by foxes and ferns, Oleron dreamed of something he had never seen. He dreamed of the sea. It came to him in sleep, not with crashing waves or roaring storms, but with a hush that sounded like distant music played on glass. He would wake with the salt of it on his feathers, though no ocean lay within 100 valleys of Merdwen. The elder owls told him it was a trick of wind or imagination. "Owls do not go to the sea," murmured Elder Norwen, blinking slowly from her perch high in the hollow tree. "Our wisdom is in the woods. The ocean belongs to gulls and ghosts." But Oleron could not forget the pull of the tide in his dreams. It echoed in his bones, humming in his wings. At twilight, he would perch at the very edge of the canopy and gaze westward, where the sky grew wide and the stars stretched their arms over the horizon. And in those moments, something inside him stirred, a quiet longing, soft but certain. He did not yet know where the sea was. He did not yet know why it called. But he knew, in the slow beat of his heart and the stillness between thoughts, that one night soon, he would follow. Not because owls should, but because he must. The night Oleron left, the moon was a sliver of silver, low and listening. He said nothing to the others. Not because he was afraid, but because the journey belonged to silence. He took only a single soft feather from his mother's nest, a token, not for flight, but for memory, and tucked it beneath his wing. The woods behind him did not protest. They simply watched, as old things do, letting go without words. He flew low at first, skimming over streams and between birch limbs. Then higher, above the treetops where the stars breathed more freely. The wind was gentle, cool with the promise of somewhere else. In it, he heard fragments of his dream song again, notes of water, sighs of unseen tidipools. The forest faded behind him, replaced by hills that rolled like sleeping beasts. Meadows unfolded in moonlight, quiet as held breath. He did not hurry. The sky was wide, and his heart was steady. At dawn, he landed on a crooked fence post beside a pasture painted with dew. A sleepy sheep blinked up at him, yawned, and went back to dreaming. Oleron tucked his wings and rested. Above him, the clouds drifted like slow ships. He was farther than any owl he knew had ever flown. And he was still following the sea. Not with a map, but with something older, something gentle and guiding. A dream, soft as the tide's whisper. The third night of his flight brought Olerin to the edge of a land he had never known. The hills no longer rolled but stretched, long and low, into flat fields where wind moved without trees to answer it. There were no owls here, only the occasional call of a distant lapwing and the flicker of field mice under the stars. But Olerin was not alone. The wind had noticed him. It had watched him glide not in circles like hawks or in lines like geese, but in soft spirals, as if listening more than traveling. And so, the wind did something rare. It changed its tune. Instead of rushing or roaring, it became music, a sighing rhythm of air that curled beneath Olerin's wings, lifting him without effort, as if cradling his purpose. It carried him over rivers that glowed in moonlight and through ruins half buried in time. It whispered old names of places no one remembered. It sang lullabies shaped like water. By morning, Olerin reached a grove of crooked trees, their branches bent from years of listening. He nestled into the highest fork and let his eyes close. In sleep, the sea came nearer, not as a place, but as a feeling. This time, he heard a bell. Just one, soft and distant. Calling. Waiting. And he knew, when he woke, that he would follow it. The bell was not loud. It did not ring with urgency. It pulsed like a heartbeat beneath the hills, slow and steady, and Olerin followed its rhythm like a thread in the sky. He flew through dawn that smelled of damp earth and wild thyme, through valleys still holding last night's stars in puddles. He passed farms just beginning to stir, chimneys yawning smoke into the breeze, and children pressing sleep-heavy faces to window panes. And then he saw it. A field, wide and gold with long grass, and in its center, a single tower, round and gentle, made of pale stone that had weathered countless rains. There was no roof, only a bell that hung suspended from a wooden beam, unmoving in the morning calm. But Olerin felt it ring. Not with sound, but with presence. He landed on the tower's edge, perching beside the bell. It shimmered faintly in the breeze, as though remembering a song. The wind rose again, soft and sure, and the bell gave a single, perfect note. Low. Deep. Warm. Olerin closed his eyes. In that sound, he saw waves, not crashing but breathing. He saw gulls, not screaming but soaring. He felt sand beneath talons he had not yet placed. The sea was near. And it was no longer only a dream. It was a promise. Beyond the bell tower, where the hills dipped low and the earth grew quiet, Olerin came upon a village unlike any he had seen. It was not large. Just a crescent of cottages nestled into the curve of the land, with roofs shaped like waves and windows that opened wide, even at night. Wind chimes made of shells and smooth glass hung from every eave, catching the breeze and singing soft harmonies. The people here did not shout. They spoke in tones like tidewater, low and warm, with pauses between words that let the wind answer. They wore cloaks the color of driftwood and walked slowly, as though always listening. When Olerin landed atop a stone gatepost, no one startled. A child looked up and offered him a crust of sea bread, still warm from the oven. An old man tipped his hat and murmured, "You've come far." Olerin blinked. The villagers did not question his presence. In their quiet way, they seemed to know that a journey could be written in feathers as well as footprints. He stayed through the night, perching on a chimney beside a small inn. The stars here pulsed brighter, as if they had grown used to reflecting off waves. And when morning came, it brought with it a new scent on the wind, briny, cool, and vast. The sea was near. So very near. It was the 6th night when the forest-born owl first saw the sea. He had flown high, above cliffs crusted with salt lilies and dunes that sang when the breeze passed over them. He had followed the wind beyond the last house, the last lantern, the last quiet voice calling a name into the dusk. And then, the world opened. The trees stopped. The land fell away. And there it was. The ocean. Endless. Slow. Silver beneath the moon. Not wild. Not roaring. But breathing. It pulsed like sleep. It shimmered like the sky remembering itself. Waves rose and fell with the softness of lullabies, and the shoreline curved like the arm of a mother cradling the earth. Olerin hovered for a long, still moment. His wings beat once, then twice, and then folded. He landed upon a driftwood post at the edge of the sand. The wind quieted. The world paused. And in that silence, the dream was no longer just a dream. It was the truth of his heart, laid wide before him. Here was the place he had never seen, but always known. Here was the sea. Olerin remained on the shore as the stars faded into dawn. He watched the tides roll in, not like an answer, but like a breath, reaching forward, retreating, as if the sea itself were pondering something ancient and kind. Seabirds called distantly overhead, their wings sharp in the sunlight, but Olerin did not lift his own. He stayed still, nestled into the hollow of a salt-smoothed post, and listened. And then, among the pebbles and sand, he saw it. A shell. Not large, not bright. Pale pink and swirled with faint lines like wind-carved ridges. It sat half-buried in the tide's lace. As he hopped closer, he noticed something unusual, not in its shape, but in its silence. Most shells, when held close, whisper faint echoes of waves. This one did not whisper. It hummed. A single, low note, like a lullaby sung from beneath the deep. Olerin tucked the shell beneath his wing, as he had once done with the feather from his mother's nest. And when he closed his eyes that evening beneath a dune's curved shadow, he dreamed again. Not of flying. Not of finding. But of floating, buoyant in an endless, quiet blue. Not lost. Held. The next morning brought clouds, but not sorrow. The sky was soft and full, the kind of gray that wraps the world in thought. Olerin stood near the titterline, the shell beside him. As the waves washed over his talons, he heard the sea's voice, not in language, but in tone. It was a voice that never hurried. A voice that did not rise to be heard. It said, "You remembered me." And he did. Not from this life, perhaps. Not from feathers and forest. But from something deeper. from the part of him that had always known how to listen without needing to name. The sea had always been calling, not just to be found, but to be remembered. He opened his wings and let the wind cradle him. He did not fly. He glided just above the foam, letting the air lift and guide. Below, fish shimmered in lazy trails. Above, the clouds drifted like floating stories. Then the shell began to sing. No words. Just a melody, low and smooth, like a horizon unfolding. It was the same song he had heard in dreams. Only now, he was awake. And it was still singing. Farther along the quiet curve of the coast, where the dunes gave way to scattered stones and tide-pools full of flickering minnows, Olorin discovered something old, and nearly forgotten. It was not built of marble or stone, but of driftwood, smooth and sun-bleached, arranged into an open circle that faced the sea. The structure had no roof, only arches where vines of seagrass swayed in the breeze. In the center stood a single post carved with spirals and feathers, and small offerings left by unseen visitors, shells, sea glass, bits of twine, and feathers not unlike his own. Olorin landed upon the central beam and tucked his wings. No one spoke. And yet, the silence was not empty. He felt the hush settle around him like a soft cloak. The kind worn not to hide, but to listen better. The shell at his side vibrated gently, and for the first time, he placed it in the center of the driftwood temple. The moment it touched the weathered post, the wind stirred, not fierce, but knowing. The sea pulled close. And then, the temple sang. Not with sound, but with memory. Olorin saw flashes of other creatures, gulls, foxes, whales, each guided here once, each leaving something behind. He saw a child from a distant village tying a ribbon to the post. An old sailor laying down a compass. A deer stepping into the tide, unafraid. The temple was not for worship. It was for remembering the truth. That all things carry the sea inside them. And some, when they are quiet enough, return to listen. Olorin stayed beside the temple through the hush of twilight. When the stars began to rise again, one by one, like thoughts remembered, he untucked the feather he had carried since the first night of his journey. It was soft now, frayed at the edges from wind and sleep and sky. He had thought it was a memory of where he came from. But now, he saw it differently. It was not only a piece of his beginning. It was a gift for where he had arrived. He placed the feather beside the shell. The wind, gentle and warm, lifted it once, just slightly, and then let it settle against the post. The temple hummed its approval. And Olorin, for the first time since leaving Merdwen Wood, felt the quiet inside him match the quiet around him. He was not lost. He was not even found. He was simply here. And here was enough. The next morning dawned in silver. The sea, now familiar and vast, stretched before Olorin like an open page. Waves curled like verses whispered between breaths, and the wind carried the scent of salt and sleep. Olorin took to the air, not to leave, but to see. He circled slowly above the driftwood temple, above the tide-pools and stones, above the path he had followed from forest to foam. The world below shimmered not only with water, but with understanding. And then, as he dipped lower, something remarkable unfolded. The sea below mirrored the sky above, perfectly. Clouds reflected in gentle waves, and waves reflected the drifting clouds. For a long, breathless moment, there was no difference between sky and sea. The world had become a sphere of soft wonder, and Olerin flew between them, an owl between mirrors, between waking and dreaming, between longing and peace. He realized then that the sea had not called him away from the forest. It had called him back to himself. For the forest, too, had tides, of wind, of time, of hush. And his dreaming heart had simply followed the shape of its own song, echoing outward like ripples. When he landed once more on the driftwood post, he looked out at the horizon and saw not distance, but wholeness. The journey had not taken him far. It had taken him deep. Olerin did not stay forever by the sea. Not because he longed to leave it, but because the sea had given him what he sought. A soundless truth, shaped in wind and wave. That those who dream are not always searching for something new. Sometimes, they are circling gently toward what has always been within. He flew once more, wings steady, back over the fields and meadows, the bell tower and the hills, until the tall trees of Myrtwinwood rose to greet him like old friends. The elder owls blinked in silence when he returned, for he did not speak of the sea. He simply perched at the edge of the canopy once again, and listened. But now, in the hush of night, he heard more than owls. He heard waves in the wind, and the lull of tides in the rustling leaves. He dreamed still, but now his dreams did not end with waking. They flowed on, like rain into rivers, rivers into sky, sky into sea. And sometimes, when the clouds are low and the world is very still, a feather drifts on the breeze, light as foam, quiet as love. And it is said that on those nights, the sea remembers the owl who dreamed of it. And the owl, from his perch in the trees, remembers the sea. Not with longing, but with joy, with belonging, and with peace. In a timeless valley, one flower stood unopened for 100 years. It didn't wait for words, but for someone who would listen, and stay. In a faraway place where the wind knew every name it whispered and the trees leaned toward the earth as if listening, there lay a valley untouched by the hurry of the world. It did not appear on any map, nor was it mentioned in timetables or travelers' guides. The valley was called Leora, though no one remembered when it had earned the name, only that it seemed to fit, as gently as a lullaby fits into the hush of twilight. Time did not keep pace in Leora. It softened. There were no clocks in the village that nestled against the valley's green arms. No bells marked hours, and no sunlit chimes declared the end of days. Life moved slowly, like mist weaving between hills, and days folded into nights with the same quiet ease that dreams fold into sleep. And in the very center of the valley, where the grass grew thick and old stones hummed beneath the moss, there stood a single flower that had not yet bloomed. It was known by everyone and touched by no one. They called it the waiting bloom. It rose from the top of a gently sloping mound, its pale green stem curled with quiet strength. At its tip, the bud remained closed, swaddled in layers of soft, faded color, neither sleeping nor waking, but suspended in stillness. The elders said it had stood there for 100 years. Some believed it was planted by a spirit of the wind. Others said a stargazer had once sung to it and promised to return. And a few, in whispers soft as feathered thoughts, said the flower waited for a heart that could understand not words, but waiting. So the people tended the path that led to it. They cleared the brambles gently and sat near it sometimes, speaking of nothing. It was never rushed, never coaxed, just quietly awaited. And so, the bloom stayed closed. But not lifeless. It was breathing. Slowly. Patiently. Like the valley itself. Far away, beyond the blue mountains where waterfalls spoke in riddles and the air tasted of pine and distant thunder, there lived a traveler named Corin. He was not famous, nor was he forgotten. Not a man of legend, but of quiet roads. His boots bore the stains of many meadows. His hands were weathered from sketching the shadows of clouds. He did not rush, no matter the weather, no matter the path. Corin had a gift, he listened. He listened to things most had long stopped hearing, the sigh of dry leaves tumbling over stone, the breath of ivy curling around a ruined wall, the soft complaint of a pebble underfoot. When he sat beside rivers, he didn't just hear water. He heard memory. And sometimes, he spoke to stones. Not because he expected answers, but because some things simply wished to be heard. One morning, as dawn smeared rose across the peaks and birds sang half-remembered songs, Corin woke with a stillness in his chest. He felt, without knowing why, that he was meant to go. He did not ask the wind where. He only packed his satchel with a few pages of paper, a small bundle of charcoal, and a wooden flute carved with ivy spirals. He set out with no map, only the pull of something gentle and distant calling him forward. Through heathered hills and groves of silver-barked trees, across bridges worn smooth by old footsteps, he walked. He passed a stream that echoed in an unfamiliar tone. A stone underfoot hummed, ever so faintly. And when he came over the last rise, the world seemed to exhale. There it lay. The valley. Leora. Wrapped in green, veiled in mist, and humming with silence. Corin did not smile, but his eyes softened. He stepped forward, down into the valley, and the grass leaned toward him like memory returning home. And at the center of the valley, the bloom, unchanged for 100 years, quivered. Not blooming. Not yet. But listening. On the morning after his arrival, Corin awoke to the sound of nothing in particular, just the hush that lives between birdsong and breeze. The sky above Leora was the color of pale tea, and the valley around him felt like a held breath that no one had the heart to exhale. He wandered slowly along the edge of the village, where low stone fences curled like old stories, and ivy crept in no particular direction. Though he had never stepped there before, Corin walked with a sense of recognition, not as though he had been there, but as though he had waited for this place, without knowing it. Near the back of a crooked cottage painted the color of fog, Corin came upon a small grove, almost hidden behind a wall of flowering vines. It was quiet, even for Leora. Inside were clocks. Dozens of them. sundials overgrown with moss, pocket watches slung from tree branches by ribbons, wooden mantel clocks tucked among lavender and sage. Each one had stopped at a different time, though none of them ticked now. They had fallen still not from neglect, but from contentment. A soft wind moved through the grove, carrying the faintest chime from a dangling chain. Corin knelt and ran his fingers over the rim of a broken hourglass. No sand remained within it, yet the glass still glimmered as if it held a memory. He did not speak aloud, but in his heart he whispered, "Even silence has rhythm." And in the distance, from the center of the valley, the unopened bloom shifted once more. Only a little. Just enough. As if reminded that someone was near who understood the quiet between ticks. That afternoon, as the sun lingered like a sleepy cat along the rim of the hills, Corin began the slow walk to the center of the valley. There was no marked trail. Only a gentle slope winding through whispering grasses and soft stones, some so smooth they seemed to hum beneath the heel. Every step felt welcomed, as if the very earth recognized his gait, not because he was meant to arrive, but because he had taken his time to do so. The hill was crowned in silence, yet it was not empty. Wildflowers dotted the base like stars scattered by careful hands. Bees moved lazily among them, not in search, but in rhythm. And at the hill's top, the bloom stood, unchanged, yet also, not. Corin paused at its base, removing his satchel with a kind of reverence. He did not reach for his charcoal, nor for his flute. He simply sat, folding his legs beneath him, and let the hush settle in. The bloom was taller than he had expected. Not grand, not imposing, but graceful in its refusal to hurry. 7 petals folded tightly, each layer holding a different hue, rose dusk, pearl gray, moon pale, and colors not found in any sky he had ever drawn. Corin reached into his satchel and brought out a single, blank page of soft paper. He placed it beside the bloom, not to draw, but to leave space. A gesture, not of action, but of presence. I do not need to understand, he thought. Only to stay. And in that moment, the breeze held its breath. The bloom did not open. But something unseen did. The days in Leora passed like mist curling through leaves, formless, slow, and kind. No one asked Corin his name. No one questioned his presence. In the valley, arrival was not about introduction. It was about listening. And Corin listened well. Each morning, he visited the hill. He never touched the bloom, nor circled it. He simply sat a respectful distance away, sometimes sketching the slope of the petals or the way the wind passed over them, other times playing soft notes on his flute, just a few, quiet and wide, like stepping stones placed across a stream. The bloom never opened. But the silence grew deeper. It was not an empty silence, but full, alive with the breath of stillness, with the echoes of unsaid things. Villagers passed now and then. They would nod to Corin in passing, some leaving a folded leaf or a smooth pebble at the foot of the hill. Gifts not meant to change the flower, but to honor its waiting. One morning, as he sat watching the dew collect along the flower's slender stem, Corin noticed something he had not seen before. The light no longer fell on the bloom. It rose from it. Faint. Barely more than a shimmer. But real. A glow that pulsed in slow rhythm, like the beat of something sleeping far beneath the roots of the world. And Corin, heart quiet, said nothing. Only stayed. There was a child in the village named Mira, who often wandered alone but never looked lost. She wore bracelets made of twine and river shells, and sang to bees when no one was listening. One golden afternoon, she approached the hill where Corin sat. She did not speak for a long time. Only sat beside him and watched the bloom. Then, with the softness of someone repeating something ancient, she said, "My grandmother told me the flower's story once." Corin turned to her, but did not ask. He knew she would continue if she wished. "It was planted by someone who never returned," Mira whispered. "Or maybe it planted itself. But it was meant to bloom for a promise, not just any promise, but a kept one. A quiet one. The kind made when no one is watching." Corin nodded, understanding not every word, but the shape of them. Promises kept in silence were often the most sacred. Mira traced a spiral in the dirt with her finger. "They say it listens for footsteps that match its memory," she added. "It remembers things older than the valley." And then, as children often do, she stood, brushed off her knees, and wandered back toward the cottages without waiting for a reply. Corin looked again at the bloom. The shimmer was stronger now. Not bright, not blooming. But steady. Something within it had begun to remember. And Corin, without knowing what promise had been made a century ago, understood this. Perhaps keeping a promise was not always about action. Sometimes it was simply staying long enough to be present when something finally opened. That night, Corin did not return to the cottage the villagers had offered him. Instead, he remained on the hillside beneath the stars, wrapped in his cloak, his back against the earth that pulsed like a slow drum beneath him. Above, the sky was full and soft, stitched with constellations that flickered like distant lullabies. The moon rose without urgency, pouring its light over the meadow, and the flower caught it, drinking it in like a long-awaited letter. Corin dreamed without sleeping. He saw the bloom, not as it was, but as it had once been, new and wide-eyed, planted in the palm of the valley like a prayer. Around it, voices moved like mist, gentle ones, uncertain, promising something not with words but with presence. The dream did not say who they were. But Corin felt their longing. He felt the patience, the ache of hope left to ripen, the beauty of something tended not with hands, but with heart. And in the center of that dream stood the flower, still closed, still waiting. But it was dreaming too. It dreamed of being seen. Truly seen, not as a mystery or miracle, but as a moment. When Corin awoke, morning light had just begun to spill over the ridges. The flower had not bloomed. But for the first time, the outermost petal had softened at the edge. Like a door left slightly ajar. Corin did not speak of what he had seen in his dream. Instead, he rose with the early light and gathered his flute. Not to play it. To offer it. He climbed the hill with quiet feet, the flute in hand, and laid it gently beside the flower. Then he stepped back, found his usual place, and sat without expectation. Time, in the valley, held no pressure. And yet something in the air had shifted. Birdsong paused. The breeze curled inward. Even the grass seemed to lean, subtly, toward the mound's center. And then, music. Not from the flute, not from the wind. From the earth. A hum, low and resonant, like the sound of a stone remembering water. It rose softly through the ground, moved into the roots of the bloom, and echoed up through its slender stem. It was not a psalm with notes. It was a music made of memory. Corin listened with his whole body. And the flower listened too. One petal began to loosen, not unfold fully, not bloom, but ease outward, just a breath. Beneath that single shifting petal was a shimmer of color no sky had ever held. The valley exhaled. And Corin closed his eyes. The promise was beginning to be kept. On the 9th day, the village awoke to a quiet that shimmered. It was not deeper than before, but clearer, like water after the silt has settled. The air was the same, yet the wind carried something new, a softness that brushed the cheeks like the memory of music. Birds paused mid-flight, not with fear, but with reverence. Even bees slowed their spiral dance in the time. And high on the hill, the flower had opened, just slightly more. The second petal now curved outward, smooth as silk drawn through morning. Where the first had revealed a blush of pearl, the second glowed with a hue that shimmered between dusk and dream, somewhere between lavender and the hush before a kiss. It was a color that could not be named. Corin sat in his usual place, sketchbook open but untouched. His charcoal rested idly on the page, as if it knew some things could not be drawn. He watched as the petals swayed in a breeze too gentle to be seen. A scent lifted from the flower, delicate, like memory warmed by sun. It smelled not of perfume, but of something felt, the weight of a held hand, the hush of an answer that required no question. And around the hill, others gathered. Quietly. One by one. Old women with palms folded over their hearts. Children with wide eyes and dusty knees. A shepherd who hummed to his goats, a baker with flour still clinging to her sleeves. No one spoke. No one needed to. The bloom had begun to tell its story. And the valley was listening. That evening, clouds gathered, not in warning, but in welcome. They moved in slowly from the east, tall and billowing, glowing with the last blush of day. As the stars blinked softly awake, the first drops fell, round, warm, and without hurry. It was not the kind of rain that sends one running, but the kind that keeps secrets and blesses everything it touches. The flower did not close. It opened further. 2 more petals unfurled, glistening under the droplets, each revealing not only color but light, as if a dawn were hidden in its folds. The hill now pulsed gently, like breath beneath a lullaby. Corin remained, unmoving, soaked to the bone and smiling without reason. He felt something shift within him, not a revelation, but a return. A long-forgotten warmth, a sense of being held, not by arms but by belonging. the kind of comfort known in childhood and in deep sleep. The villagers stayed too, some beneath shawls, others with hands upturned. They wept without sadness. They laughed without noise. Even the sheep in their fields stood still, watching the petals catch the rain. It had been said, once, that the bloom would open only when a promise had been fulfilled. But Corin understood now. The promise had never been a single act. It had been a waiting. A shared silence. A trust that someone would come, not to solve, but to sit. Not to speak, but to stay. And so the flower bloomed, slowly, gently, in rainlight and memory. And the valley bloomed with it. The 11th morning rose without sound. No bird called, no leaf stirred, and yet everything was alive, tingling with a softness too gentle to be named. Mist floated low across the meadows like silken scarves, and the dew glowed faintly gold, as if kissed by some inner light. At the hill's crest, the bloom stood fully open now. Not in rush or grandeur, but in quiet fullness, like a song that has been sung to the very last note. Its petals, 7 in all, curved outward like a spiral drawn by wind. They shimmered with a light not of the sun, but of memory, colors born from kindness, from hope kept in secret, from the weight of 100 quiet years. At the center of the bloom, nestled within the final ring of pale gold, something pulsed gently. A drop of light. Not flame, not jewel, just a single orb of soft radiance, breathing slowly as though it lived. The villagers gathered again, each taking their place without instruction. They formed no circle, spoke no words. Some stood. Some knelt. A few simply lay back in the grass, eyes open to the sky. Corin stepped forward, not to touch, but to kneel beside the bloom. And there it was. Not an answer. Not a reward. But a moment. The kind that comes not at the end, but when something deep within finally says yes. And in that moment, the drop of light rose gently from the flower's heart, hovered for a breathless second, and drifted upward, vanishing into the sky like a thought finally spoken. The bloom had opened. And so had the valley. It did not close. That is what the villagers remember most. Long after the rain passed, long after the final breath of mist lifted from the hill, the bloom remained open. But it no longer glowed. It did not need to. It had become a part of the valley's rhythm, a mark not of mystery, but of presence. It no longer waited. It simply was. And Corin? He stayed for a while longer, then quietly rose one day and gathered his things. He took nothing from the valley, not even a sketch. The pages he carried remained blank. But something inside him had changed. Not loudly. Not visibly. But deeply. He left with lighter steps, with stillness in his breath and a silence that hummed softly beneath his ribs. He returned to his wandering. To speaking with stones. To listening for forgotten winds. But wherever he went, he carried the story of the bloom, not in words, but in the way he lingered beside a stream, or sat with someone who simply needed to be seen. And it is said, though only in the quietest of places, that the bloom still stands on the hill in Leora. It does not speak. It does not change. It waits no longer. But when someone enters the valley with a heart that listens, it leans slightly toward them, as if remembering. And in that moment, the world softens. And time, for just a little while, blooms.